IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Arjun and I have with me today Atish, Padhy and Aarthi, Ratnam, and we're going to be talking about something very interesting. But before we get into the episode, I just wanted to tell you about the Takshashila Institution's educational program. So we are a independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting one semester and 1 year long that are tailor-made specifically for people like you. They're all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for both our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy and our postgraduate program in public policy. The program begins on 15th January 2022 and the last day to apply is on 8th January 2022. Visit school.takshashila.org.in to find out more. So getting into the episode, today we have Atish and Aarthi who are going to be talking about how food, climate change, and animal rearing all have relations with each other. So how are each other connected? How are each other affecting one another? And this is what we're going to find out. We often talk about the impact of the food industry on climate, but what about the other way around? So there is also this theory that our diets might change due to climate change and how our diets might change due to the climate crisis which is happening right now. There is also the theory of crops going fully extinct and some crops which are not going to be available in the future. But we do not have significant evidence for that. But there is significant evidence for food production getting affected by climate change. So that is something we're talking about today. So Aarti, I wanted to ask you about how climate change is altering the production of food products, especially in certain specific countries which are facing the brunt of the climate crisis, like hard and long winters or summers which are extremely hot and the temperatures rising above the threshold, which are resulting in crops and certain foods being not produced on a large scale basis. So, can you tell us about any examples you have found wherein food production has been severely affected due to climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the countries that's been severely affected is Libya. And in fact, despite being one of the driest countries in the world, with only less than 2% of its area receiving enough of rain to support agriculture, there are at least 10,000 beekeepers who have managed to keep the beekeeping tradition going. It has been passed down from generations and is such an important part of their culture, to such an extent that Libyan beekeepers produce at least 19 types of honey. But recently, increasing temperatures, there has been a devastating impact on the production of honey. So, the ideal range for a good production of honey would be between 12 degrees to 38 degrees. But recently, especially in 2021, the temperature has reached somewhere between 40 to 46, which is just not an ideal condition for beekeeping. And it's not just the temperature, but it's also deforestation and a reduction in precipitation. And earlier, some of the honeys, which were already pricey because they were imported, it used to be around $13, but now it's up almost $18 now. So as the local production of honey has dropped, prices have risen, and this has definitely affected sales. And which also means it's started to affect individuals and their livelihood, which is something we will also look at later on. But this is definitely one example about how climate change is affecting food production and livelihood.
That's really interesting. I mean, no one would have thought of Libya being an example as climate change has affected their food production. So, Atish, I wanted to ask you about something that is also related to food, but it's slightly deviating its beverages. And there is also evidence of how the consumption, growing seasons, and flavor of certain beverages is also going to be altered due to the effects of climate change. Like, what are these beverages we're talking about, and where has this been seen in?
Hey Arjun, glad to be here. So, yeah, what you mentioned about how beverages are being affected by climate change is unfortunately quite true. Now, someone that enjoys tea very much, tea is one of the things that is, which is likely to be affected due to climate change. In India, especially, we know that tea often grows in foothills of the Himalayas, in Assam and in Darjeeling, in the Nilgiris as well, in southern India. So these are areas, because they're hilly, the soil there is often looser, right? And as the monsoon becomes longer across the India due to climate change, as we're seeing this year in Bangalore also, right? Like this year, the rainfall that the city has received has been staggering. And what that does is, firstly, it erodes the soil, of course, because these are hilly areas. But more importantly, tea is a very complex and nuanced beverage, which has thousands and thousands of different complex chemicals that induce the various health benefits and tastes that tea gives us. Right. So there's something called phenolic compounds, which are essential to the taste of tea. Tea is also extremely rich in antioxidants, and these are affected due to changing weather patterns. So in Assam, for example, the most valuable tea is harvested in what is called the first and second flushes. So around the first flush happens around March, second flush in June, and that assumes that the monsoons have not set in yet, and there is a longer growing period. But as monsoon stretches and the spring period and the summer shortens, a lot of the farming would eventually have to shift to higher altitudes, because firstly the weather, because the temperature is increasing, and also because of increased rainfalls. So tea is going to be affected very much by climate change. In China as well, in the southern regions where tea is grown, early onset of the rainfalls is going to be affecting tea a lot. Again, another very nuanced beverage is wine, and wines are also going to be affected by climate change. A few years ago, actually, a lot of people were surprised that one of the, now there are wines coming out of Britain, which historically, when you think of Britain, you don't associate it with wine. You just associate it with like bad rainfall and like surly people and cricket, right? Or football. You don't associate it with wine, and now you have wines coming out of England because the conditions which were earlier much harsher, colder because of global warming are becoming more conducive to the growing of wines. So, on the other hand, in places like Argentina, wine grapes are grown much farther south because the climate in the central areas is becoming more hot. So they have to go higher up the Andes and uh, towards the southern reaches of the Southern American continent in order to find suitable climates to grow wines. And one of the dangers with wines is that the grapes can over ripen, and with increasing global warming and climate change, that becomes a higher concern. So that is something that is which is driving people to take up new ways to solve the problem. So in France, in areas that are mostly associated with the vintage wines that we consume today, they have tried out new techniques to make sure that they can control climate. So as hailstorms come more suddenly and more frequently in these French regions where wine is grown, they're shooting hailstorm clouds with silver iodide particles. And of course, because this also drives up the price of wine, because you have another process that is adding to the input costs. But they have realized that shooting these silver iodide particles into hailstorm clouds in what is called a hail shield over the entire region helps preserve it from being damaged. So these are some things that people are doing to make sure that tea and wine are still consumed. Now, of course, it's very unlikely that either of these would just entirely be wiped out. What might happen is that taste profiles will change significantly. Some varieties of wines and some varieties of tea might win out while others lose. And most importantly, they might become much more expensive, and therefore their access might become more inequitable.
Well, that's sobering to hear. We were talking about how climate change also affects the livelihoods of people who are actually working in the agriculture sector or in the food production sector. So, Aarti, I wanted to ask you about something related to this. Has there been instances of people getting affected due to climate change as we move towards a more renewable energy driven society or towards a more green energy society? People are and governments are pushing forward for renewable sources of energy, resulting in changing of food production and other areas of agriculture sector. So, has there been any instance of this?
Yeah, definitely. Now that people are becoming more aware of the climate change issue, a lot of countries are trying to come up with more environmental friendly solutions. But this does come at a cost. For instance, take Brazil. It is the world's second largest producer of ethanol, which is a biofuel made from sugarcane, corn, and other crops, which, when mixed with gasoline, aims to reduce carbon emission from vehicles powered by fossil fuels. So much of the gasoline in the US now contains ethanol, which is a key element of the world's transition from carbon based economy to a more greener one. But like I said, this does come at a cost because workers who are contributing to the fight against climate change are also becoming victims to it because of these extreme temperatures. And it could be, rising temperatures, which just becomes extremely difficult for them to walk in those conditions. And for many people across the world, agriculture is their primary source of income. It is what they do for a job. And if they don't have sustainable working conditions, it's not only going to affect them, but it is in turn going to affect the production of food. So now there are a couple of NGOs that are trying to ensure that the production of sugar and ethanol meets not just environmental standards but also social standards. But sadly, the Brazilian authorities feel that these organizations have failed to recognize inhuman working conditions. So there is the US Environmental Protection Agency. It has laid down guidelines, but they don't specifically address inhumane labor practices. So it is quite vague right now. And while we are trying to identify more environmental friendly solutions, I think it's really important to remember that it shouldn't be a trade off. Just because it's more eco friendly, it should not come at a cost of human working conditions. And it's creating such a vicious cycle right now. And I think it's really important that we find some sort of solution that changes this and addresses both of these issues that we're facing now.
Well, on that note, let's take a break and we'll be right back with the episode.
Your computer can be compromised in many ways, and all cyber attacks ultimately affect your files and apps by accessing everything that's on your PC. Intel vPro keeps you safe from cyber attacks using the Intel Hardware Shield, which has three groups of capabilities. First, advanced threat protection, quickly detecting issues like ransomware and crypto mining. Second, below the OS security, identifying unauthorized changes to hardware. And lastly, application and data protection, preventing malware injections. So, secure your organization's productivity with Intel vPro's hardware-based security. Visit intel.in/IT heroes to know more. Remember, Intel vPro is built for business.
Welcome back to this episode of All Things Policy. So, we were talking about livelihoods and how climate change affects certain livelihoods and the food production itself. Now, I want to get into the animal rearing and animal husbandry aspect of it. There has also been certain instances where climate change has kind of altered the pattern of rearing and consumption of certain animals. This has changed the animal husbandry patterns in certain countries and the consumption of different meats. Atish, I wanted to ask you about this specifically. Has there been any specific case for this, or is it can we expect this going forward with climate change playing such a major role?
Right. So, as Aarthi also spoke spoke about, livelihoods are at stake due to climate change. And one of the things that governs this relationship is, especially in the case of animal husbandry, is what kind of species in general are likely to benefit from climate change, whose numbers are likely to grow, and what kinds are not likely to grow. And that's a very complex relationship. And I think just to show that, I was previously talking about tea. And an interesting thing is there is a certain kind of pest for teas which often reduces the final yield by, I think, 20-30%. But because the pest and the tea plants have co-evolved over millions of years, what it also does is that the tea plant makes certain chemicals as defense, which actually enhances the flavors of the tea, and those are especially more expensive and more sought after. So this is a very complex relationship because the amount of pests is likely to increase with climate change. Because most pests across the world often grow in drier conditions. Drier conditions favor them, especially in hilly areas where they're more able to survive colder, harsher climates where tea is grown. Now, in other contexts, this same relationship of which animals benefit and which do not. A very good example of this is in Bangladesh. Now we know that Bangladesh is one of the lowest lying countries in the world and is at imminent threat from rising sea levels. Much of the Sundarban has already been affected, and the areas around the Sundarban are increasingly getting more and more affected by rising sea levels. So the way many people in Bangladesh have adapted to this problem is by shifting from rearing chickens to rearing ducks. And before I go into this, I just want to talk about how the very fact that we now take chicken to be an ubiquitous variety of meat, like so anyone who is a carnivore or a meat eater normally eats chicken as the primary meat. But that was not the case even as recently as 1950s in many parts of the United States, where beef was still the primary component of a meat eater's diet. And that changed, of course, when feed technology became better. You could supplement food with vitamins, etc., etc. But what I'm trying to say is diets keep changing throughout history, and Bangladesh with climate change is showing us how you can adapt to it in an effective way. So, because chickens, especially the farm-bred broiler chickens that constitute our food today, they are extremely sensitive to wetter conditions, to climate, to temperatures as well. So therefore, you would often see that they are reared in air-conditioned surroundings or whatever, right? Because they are extremely sensitive to changes in that, and they are more likely to fall sick and die if the weather keeps changing too much. They chickens cannot swim, and so as seawater levels go up, these chickens are likelier to develop infections and die. So Bangladeshi farmers have realized that it's better to raise ducks instead. Now earlier ducks used to be a winter delicacy, and now they are becoming more of a year-round food. Bangladesh is production of duck meat and duck eggs in Bangladesh has grown a lot over the last few years. Duck is becoming more and more available. Currently, production of duck is far more profitable than chicken as well because supply is still less as compared to chicken. That might fall as supply increases, but for farmers, it's an incentive to go to duck farming because for the same amount of input, they're likely to reap far more profits. And across Bangladesh, there are other things that are also being done. So now, with more areas that are being flooded, they're trying to rear shrimps there. Shrimp rearing and shrimp farming has become extremely important in Bangladesh. Similarly, there's a industry growing of crab fattening because, again, with rising water levels, crabs, shrimps, these kind of animals are more likely to survive in wetter conditions. So that is how Bangladeshi farmers are adapting to this industry because they are one of the most vulnerable groups in the world because they are especially in the low-lying areas where due to salinity of the seawater, their soil, it's difficult to grow rice. It's difficult to grow any wheat, any crop for that matter, and therefore they have to adapt to these various conditions. So that's how livelihood is affected in just our neighborhood.
That's really interesting. Aarti, now I just wanted to dwell away from the whole concept of climate change and food production. We've seen many instances of how food production and certain crops have been affected due to climate change. But there is this question of whether the climate crisis kind of will hamper the global food supply chain. So even if food and certain crops are grown somewhere halfway across the world, will we actually be able to receive it from due to globalization or due to trade or whatever? Will we get that supply of food as it was before? Is that something which will also be affected?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take, for instance, Thanksgiving. We're around the holiday season right now. And if you look at all of the meals that are associated with Thanksgiving, every single one of those meals are being affected because of climate change. Like, just take turkey, right? It is the centerpiece of any Thanksgiving meal. But because of rising temperatures, it can stress the birds, and which can cause them to grow at a slower rate or even die. And farmers who feed these turkeys with commercially produced crops like corn and grain, we know that the production of these crops have already been affected, which will again affect the price and availability of the birds. But it's not just a matter of keeping the birds cool and fed. It's also about how there aren't any poultry farmers who are willing to continue growing turkeys in these regions. So for instance, after Hurricane Katrina, many of the farmers abandoned the coastline because it just isn't, again, like a sustainable place for them to live. So you can see how everything is so interconnected. And it's not just turkey, right? Like, take any of the other dishes that are associated with Thanksgiving. It can be, let's say, pumpkins. These pumpkins are also susceptible to cold and frost, which can cause them to soften and rot before the harvest. So there's that's another food. And then there are cranberries, which has been a native fruit to North America, and it's been such an essential part of the Thanksgiving table, right? But extreme heat and warmer winters with less ice and fluctuation between heavy rains and drought is seriously taking a toll on cranberry plants, which results in more like injured berries and less nutritional crops. So it's not just the food production that's being affected, but also the nutritional content is starting to deplete. Same thing with any with wheat based stuff, like, let's say, your breads, right? So even those, the wheat is being stripped of its nutritional value. So minerals such as protein, iron, and zinc are all being affected. So even the food that you're eating, even if it's available, it's hard to tell whether they're going to be the most nutritionally dense food. So it's so important to see, how our eating habits are going to change. So it's not necessarily that the food production is going to be affected, but it could also be food, the quality of food that's being affected as well. So there's so many important dimensions to this that we need to consider. And I mean, we've spoken about how, the kinds of food that are being affected and how it's affecting, human life. But I think right now we need to come up with solutions where we address each of these issues across the world, because we need to see how we can create more sustainable living standards and production standards.
If I can come in here. So, as Aarthi was talking about how the Thanksgiving meal is changing, something occurred in me, which was that I think the animals we rear for food now, like chickens or goats, or lamb, cows, fish, whatever that we rear to eat, I think the animals that we are going to rear is also going to change. The Bangladesh example shows that, of course. But also, as I was saying, historically, geese and partridges were more important in medieval Europe than chickens were. So I think we are going to see that change happening again. So, for example, I think in the United States, what people are now starting to do is they have a huge wild boar problem. Wild boars are an invasive species in most of America, and many states have legalized hunting, and there are many restaurants popping up that have all their foods that entirely have wild boar recipes based on their meat. Similarly, I think foods that we otherwise would not really like or think were disgusting, I think we're going to start eating them more, especially for people that might not have access to more expensive food. So something like insects, insects might become a more important part of our diets. Also, a lot more seaweed. Seaweed is already a part of many Southeast Asian and East Asian cultures. And I think, and seaweed is also great for reducing carbon dioxide in water and sucking up much of the, and reversing to some extent much of the damage that climate change does. Right. So I think that might start getting read more. And as I was saying, we probably will be eating more crustaceans, right? Crabs, shrimp, lobster. So I think that shift will happen. Similarly, like foods that normally grew in colder climates are likely to start becoming more and more expensive, more and more inaccessible. And we might start eating more fungi. Many fungi are superfoods. They are packed full of nutrients, but often we have not eaten them. I mean, a lot of indigenous cultures did eat a lot of fungi, but now, of course, we eat food that is a lot different from, I think, what ancient Indians or ancient Native American people or indigenous people anywhere used to eat. So I think some of those changes are also likely to happen. We will start accepting more and more food that we thought was disgusting. And of course, I think some of this problem might also be solved by the fact that there is lab grown meat that is happening. People might shift to plant based, like tofu turkey, which is coming up in some places in America. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how our most famous meals, say even the biryani in India, might evolve in the next 50, 60, 100 years with climate change.
Yeah, I'd just also like to add to that. We talk about how we all sort of, move towards a similar kind of diet, and how people around the world are dependent on a certain region for the production of food, right? But interestingly, there has been an increase in the standardization of diets. The food we eat today are 36% more similar than they were back in the 1960s. So this is good in some ways, because that way, the same kind of foods are accessible to everyone around the world. But again, this is also bad because everyone is dependent on a particular region, and that over dependence will leave us more vulnerable to any environmental threat. So I think it's really important to see how, and again, it just comes back to how we can identify the most sustainable form of production. And while we are finding substitutes to all of these foods right now, eventually, because there is going to be a lack of availability of these food, it is going to end up increasing the cost, and which is soon going to become unaffordable to a lot of people from the poorer countries. So everything is interconnected. And I think it's so important that now that we've identified the issue, which is great, and more people are starting to take it seriously. But I think now we need to really focus on coming up with solutions that, are not just, as we have emphasized so far, not just environmental friendly, but also sustainable for humans as well.
Well, that was definitely an interesting conversation, knowing how climate change is going to affect all our food habits, our diet, and what we might eat going forward in the next, I'd say, 20, 30 years. Thank you guys for joining me on this debate, and thank you for all the listeners for tuning in. We'll see you in the next episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you, Arjun. It was great being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by Ganesh Ramani. He's the Managing Director at Mars Pet Care India. They discuss pet ownership and pet homelessness and an AI-driven pet lost and found app. We welcome another new show to our network, Ikka Dukka Economy with Abhinav Trivedi. In the first episode of this Hindi language show, Abhinav speaks to Dr. Bharat Junjunwala about fiscal deficit and its effects on our daily lives. Tune in to new episodes every Tuesday. On All Things Policy, the folks from Takshashila Institute discuss the lack of support for India's police personnel. On Tede Mere Raste, Keshav introduces us to Chandrabhaga Beach. On The Wire Talks, Anushka Jain, lawyer and policy researcher, talks to Siddharth. They discuss the dangers of facial recognition and why her organization started the campaign Ban the Scan. And on Marathi Kirkitun, Dr. Rajiv and Manik Deshmukh explore the evergreen poetry of the late poet Mangesh Patgaonkar. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, do remember, go check out our website, ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, to get a list of all of our YouTube channels. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, HDFC Mutual Fund, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
सफर, रास्ते, मंजिल और मुकाम, अक्सर ये हमसे कुछ कहना चाहते हैं, पर हम हैं कि अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में इन्हें सुनने से कतराते हैं। नमस्ते दोस्तों, मेरा नाम है केशव चतुर्वेदी और मैं आपको ले चलूंगा कुछ ऐसे सफर पर जहां आपको एक नया नजरिया मिलेगा सफर और मंजिलों को देखने का। आइए इन किस्से कहानियों में डूब जाएं। हर मंगलवार और शुक्रवार